Welcome to Chapter 2, Challenges for Managers. In this chapter, we are talking about 4 broadly defined challenges: globalization, diversity, ethics, and technology. Each of these challenges needs to be considered by people who want to understand, again, what makes people tick in organizations, what causes them to do what they do. So we're going to start with globalization. And we begin by talking about understanding cultural differences. And as it notes in the different bullet points on this slide, first, organizations have to appreciate the differences among cultures. It's not enough to be aware of differences. They have to understand and really value those differences, including what might be called microcultural differences. So within cultures, we all know that even within the United States, for example, there are many different kinds of cultures within the broader U.S. culture. And one of those might refer to generation gaps. So boomers versus Gen Xers versus millennials. They don't always have the same values and norms. And understanding those microcultural differences is really key. In terms of what's happening career-wise, over the last 30 years, we've seen an increase, thanks to globalization, in what are called expatriate managers, or expats. These are managers who work in a country other than their home country, and also folks who are considered international executives. These are people whose jobs have an international scope, but they might not live in a country other than their home country. Geert Hofstede is someone who's done a tremendous amount of research on cultural differences across countries. And he talks specifically about these 5 different dimensions: individualism versus collectivism, power distance in terms of high versus low, uncertainty avoidance in terms of high versus low, masculinity versus femininity, and finally long-term versus short-term orientation. I'm going to discuss each of these in turn. So we talk about individualism versus collectivism. And individualism, no surprise here, is a cultural orientation in which people belong to very loose social frameworks, and their primary concern is for themselves and for their direct families, so the people with whom they live. Collectivist cultures, on the other hand, here individuals belong to tightly knit social frameworks, and they depend strongly on extended families or clans. In the United States, just as an example, we tend to be very individualistic, at least culturally, where people tend to look after themselves and their direct families. As a comparison, in Mexico, folks tend to be more collectivistic. They recognize and prefer a high level of interdependence upon one another, and so you are far more likely to see people talking about the importance and value of their extended families. Power distance is the second dimension that Hofstede discusses, and this is defined as the degree to which a culture accepts unequal distribution of power, particularly in institutions and organizations. So when we say there's a high degree of power distance, there we're saying it's okay to have inequality. We don't mind having unequal distributions of power, versus when power distance is described as being low, we argue that unequal is not okay. So again, for comparison's sake, the United States, we tend to be low with respect to power distance. We want equality. Great example of this: if you look at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, take a look at the parking lots. There is no special parking for faculty or staff members. We all have to grub for the same parking spots. We all drive around looking for the very best. Or look at the cafeteria. We all get in line. There's one cafeteria for students, faculty, and staff. There isn't a separate dining location for faculty and staff. And when we all get to, let's say, the Cloud Commons, we all have to pick up a tray and get in line. Doesn't matter what our classification is. Whereas in Mexico, they prefer high power distance. They're very hierarchical. They accept that power distance is unequal, and that's in fact the way they prefer it. The third dimension is uncertainty avoidance, and this is the degree to which a culture tolerates ambiguity and uncertainty. When we describe that as high, we're saying, yeah, society just doesn't like ambiguity. We don't like uncertainty, as opposed to low, where the society doesn't mind ambiguous. Generally speaking, in the United States, we tend to be low, meaning that we don't mind ambiguity, that in fact we're very tolerant of new ideas, and yet more recently we've become a little paranoid, afraid, nervous about the new, if you will. And Hofstadter traces this in part to 9/11 and our newfound fear of things that are different. In Mexico, uncertainty avoidance tends to be high, meaning they're not really fans of ambiguous or uncertain situations, and so they have rules, I would say norms, that really dictate how they behave, and they tend to pay pretty careful attention to those norms. The fourth dimension is masculinity versus femininity, and don't confuse this by thinking about gender of individuals. Don't think about this dimension that way at all. Instead, masculinity is defined as a cultural orientation in which assertiveness and materialism are valued. And so, one way of characterizing this is saying we want to be the best of the best of the best. Whereas femininity is a cultural orientation in which relationships and concern for others are both valued. And here, the expectation is that people need to like what they do. That's considered more important than wanting to be the best. Now, this is an example of a dimension where both the United States and the Mexico are pretty much the same. We are more masculine in the United States. Again, this has nothing to do with the number of men versus women, but rather, this notion of assertiveness and materialism and a winner-takes-all attitude. In Mexico, masculinity manifests as machismo, again, it's all about wanting to be the best. The final dimension discussed in our text from Hofstadter deals with time orientation, and here we're talking about whether the culture's values tend to be oriented toward the future or toward the past and the present. A long-term orientation tends to focus on the future, thrift, persistence, continuing to work toward those long-term goals. Short-term, it's more about the past, and I would argue even more about the present. Some respect for tradition, and then fulfilling social obligations. In the United States, we have an interesting mix of both short and long term. Certainly, our business cycles are focused on the short term, the present, and not so much the past, other than for comparison. But also long term, where we are interested in persisting and trying to accomplish big goals. Mexico, as much as they respect tradition, and they certainly do, they are in fact more focused on persisting toward long-term goals, and they think really long-term, much more long-term than we tend to in the United States. So when they build a building, for example, they will take the cash that they currently have, they will build perhaps one story, but they will also put in the rods to enable a second story when they have the money, whenever that might be. I think that's a great example illustrating their focus on the long term. It's the long game for them. So, as a summary, where the U.S. stands, in general, again, recognizing that within the United States, as is true within any country, there are these microcultures, but generally speaking, this chart really captures the U.S. We are more individualistic, low power distance. In other words, we believe in what's called egalitarianism. We think that we should all be equals. We think that we should be able to address so-called important people by their first names. We are low on uncertainty avoidance in general, so we are willing to take risks. We like new ideas. We tend to be more masculine, and then we have a mix of both long-term and short-term orientation. Mexico, on the other hand, much more collectivist, so much more concerned with extended interdependence. High power distance, so they are bigger fans of hierarchies. Higher uncertainty avoidance, so less interest in risk. Again, masculine, just like within the United States, and more of a long-term orientation. All right. When we talk about developing cross-cultural sensitivity, something that each one of us needs to do to not only be familiar with, but also sensitive to how cultures might differ, how norms might differ, how values might differ, how all of those norms and values are to be respected and honored. I think there's no better way to develop your cross-cultural sensitivity than to have personal experience with different cultures. And so I would strongly encourage each of you to travel outside of the country, to interact with people from different cultures, to learn how they view the world, and to experience their sense of how the world works. I think one of the things you discover when you travel broadly is you learn a lot more about your own values, your own norms. You learn a lot about your own country, and you learn a lot about how you might see the world differently if you lived elsewhere. In addition to that personal experience, organizations are offering more cultural sensitivity training, especially as they find themselves working globally. They find themselves creating cross-cultural task forces and teams, putting people from different cultures together to work on common problems, thus enabling everyone to see those various perspectives. And then within the HR function, folks working within HR are having to think more globally in terms of all their different functions, including planning, recruitment, selection, compensation, training and development. What are the norms and values in different countries? As we move into, let's say, Mexico or Great Britain or Ghana in Africa or New Zealand, how do they view these different human resource functions? For example, do they view compensation the same, or do they view it quite differently? What about training and development? Do they see that as being something that is the purview or responsibility of the individual employee, or is that something that the organization takes on? Next, we talk about diversity, which is defined here as all forms of individual differences. And then there's a list of some particular examples: culture, ethnicity, gender, age, ability, personality, religious affiliation, economic class, social status, military attachment, and sexual orientation. Now, your text discusses at length 4 of these categories of individual differences: ethnic differences, gender differences, age differences, and ability differences. And my counsel to you is to read these sections of the text very, very carefully and to take copious notes on them. The benefits and problems associated with diversity, this is a pretty straightforward list. So, having the most diverse workforce possible allows us to attract and retain the best human talent, enables us to improve our marketing efforts as we think about recruiting people who represent that target market, for example. Allows us to be more creative and innovative. When you have people who think differently from one another, that's really the source of creativity. Having people who all think the same way, honestly, that doesn't do a whole lot for your creativity. You tend to come up with pretty stagnant solutions. So having a diverse group of people, whether it's diverse in terms of age or ethnicity or socioeconomic status, whatever it is, it doesn't matter, that's likely to improve your creativity, which can, of course, lead to better problem solving. And it also allows our organization to be more flexible. Everything has its problems, and diversity can be accompanied with a resistance to change, a lack of cohesiveness as people struggle to find, well, what do we have in common? We're different perhaps in terms of our generation. We're different perhaps in terms of our educational backgrounds. Maybe it's our socioeconomics or our abilities. What's our common ground? How can we come together? Those differences can cause or contribute to communication problems as people use words differently, even sometimes the same words, which can also lead to conflicts as people discover that they don't value the same things. And anytime you bring people together whose backgrounds are different on whatever dimension, it will slow decision making. This is true in general for any group of people as opposed to an individual, but certainly more diverse groups, because they have to work through coming to an understanding, learning to not only understand but appreciate the way that different people think. So at least initially that can slow decision making, but ultimately it should lead to better creativity and better problem solving. And so you trade off some of these problems for those benefits. The third major issue raised in this chapter deals with ethics. And so the text again does a nice job of talking about some major theories And again, I want to encourage you strongly to read each of these very carefully, take some good notes, make sure you're understanding what each of these very broad theories is trying to get at. So consequential theory, great example of this is utilitarianism. Basically, theories that fit into this mode emphasize the consequences or the results or the outcomes of our behavior. Utilitarianism, as an example of this, talks about trying to maximize benefits or consequences or results for the greatest number of people. Of course, one of the challenges associated with this way of thinking is that you're not thinking about the process that's used to make a decision, and it's very easy to disregard minority opinions. Well, ultimately, those may prove to be the most important opinions. So, utilitarianism has some issues. Rule-based theories, a good example would be the theory that was put forward by Immanuel Kant, in which he talks about imperatives, rights or moral rights that every single human being has. So again, it says it's an ethical theory that emphasizes the character of the act itself rather than the effects. So here we're not concerned with consequences. We're concerned with, okay, well, what rights do each of us have? For example, Kant would argue we all have the right to dignity. We all have the right to beneficence. The challenges associated with rule-based theories is sometimes the rights of individuals can be in conflict with one another. The last major category is character theory, which is a theory that emphasizes the character of the individual and the intent of the actor rather than the character of the act itself or its consequences. So here basically intentions matter. What was it that you were hoping for as opposed to what actually happened or as opposed to what are people's rights? Some dilemmas that we will face in the workplace that you may have already faced in the workplace include, for example, employee rights issues. I think these are becoming even more significant as we go forward in time. For example, I read an article this morning talking about our right to ask others for their salaries, to ask and know what others are making so that we can in fact ensure that we're being paid fairly. That's an employee right issue. And some people will tell you that an employer can actually punish you for asking your colleagues about their salaries. But in fact, it is perfectly legal for you to ask your fellow employees what they make, and it is illegal for an employer to constrain you from doing that. In other words, they can't actually punish you for talking to your coworkers about salary. Sexual harassment is a major, again, ethical issue that needs attention within organizations. It's defined here for you as unwelcome verbal or physical sexual attention that affects an employee's job conditions or creates a hostile working environment. Some of the specific types of this are gender harassment, unwanted sexual attention, sexual coercion. Again, read this topical area very carefully in your text. A whistleblower is defined as someone who tells outside authorities about wrongdoing by his or her company or coworkers. And one of the challenges with being a whistleblower is you might be seen as a hero or you might be seen as a wretch, depending on people's perspectives. Probably one of the most famous cases of whistleblowing is in the Enron case, in which it needed to be someone from inside to say, hey, something that's really not okay is happening within this organization, and then finally it was investigated properly. The last topic under ethics, at least on this slide, deals with social responsibility, which is the obligation of an organization to behave ethically in its social environment and its natural environment and the economic environment. So corporate social responsibility takes into account what we call the triple bottom line, where we're thinking about the consequences of our actions on the people who are affected, the planet, and also our profits, and trying to balance each of those key responsibilities. A major topic within the ethics area is what is known as organizational justice. And there are two different kinds. The first is distributive justice, and here we're talking about the fairness of outcomes that individuals receive in an organization. In other words, is a person's salary fair? Is a person's benefits fair? So what they receive, is that considered fair? The other kind of justice is procedural justice. This is the fairness of the process that's used to decide those outcomes. So is the performance evaluation process that yields salary outcomes, is that fair? Is that process fair? Are hiring processes fair or not? Again, the focus is on process. All right, the fourth and final major topic is technology, which is defined as the intellectual and mechanical processes that are used by an organization to transform or change inputs into products or services that meet organizational goals. So basically, technology is everything, every single thing we use to take inputs and turn them into outputs. Some issues that are raised in your text and that you should pay careful attention to: alternative work arrangements, examples, telecommuting, having satellite offices, having virtual offices. With these alternative work arrangements, there are positives and negatives. Employees, for example, gain flexibility. You might be able to rearrange your schedule so that you can go to that kid concert, or go to that doctor appointment, or get to that store before it closes, and then maybe work earlier or work later, so you have this flexibility. You save the time and energy costs associated with a commute to work, and you can enjoy comforts of home, your favorite kind of coffee, for example, sitting in your jammas. On the flip side, it's easy to be distracted when you're working from home. That pile of laundry that needs doing. Well, if you were at the work site, you wouldn't even be thinking about it. But since you're sitting in your house, you might be. You lack socialization opportunities. And keep in mind, people are social creatures. We do, even the most introverted among us, do need to be around people occasionally. It causes us to lack interaction with our supervisors, and in some cases, that means those supervisors won't be thinking about us when they're thinking about promotion or advancement opportunities, because honestly, they just don't see us. So we're not at the forefront of their thinking. It can also cause employees to identify less with the organization because they don't go someplace, because they don't see people who work in the organization. They might not think very much about that organization. Technological change ultimately requires managers, they've got to have the technical competence to gain their workers' respect. So they have to know how to use the technology they're asking their workers to use. Managers have to help workers manage the stress that comes along with all of that technology. And managers have to take advantage of all the information that's available to motivate, coach, counsel, but not to control. So it's not about using technology to spy on people, but rather to enable them to be more satisfied and to perform at increasingly higher levels. That's really what the role of managers should be. That brings us to the end of Chapter 2. As it says here, that's all, folks. Thanks.